Hi, I'm still making a game. A Foddian game, precision platformer, rage game, or whatever you want to call them. So, what's been happening since the last devlog in my still untitled game? Let's dive in and take a look. I'm Backware Games and welcome to my channel. As I mentioned in my last video, I've been working towards sketching out the whole world itself into different sections that I want for the game. I started out by basically mapping out the whole world in chunks, where each chunk represents a new area of the world. I did this in Affinity Designer with just basic shapes like rectangles, circles and such. I then started to add a little more detail around each area. What kind of theme is this area, what kind of mechanics should be here, and so on. I learned this technique from Goodgis in a video about designing great Metroidvania levels. Now, my game is by no means a Metroidvania, but the concepts can still apply here. I won't be showing you the descriptions of each area since these are entering spoiler territory, but as you can see, I've mapped out the whole world from the beginning to the end. Of course, things will change, they already have, and more on that later. But it's good to have a guideline on where you're headed with your game. Now, you might be thinking, how are you designing a world for a game that you still don't know the theme or overall design for? Well, since the last devlog, I got a bunch of amazing feedback and ideas, and I think I actually managed to come up with a good and fun setting for my game. Now, I'm not fully ready to talk about it yet, since I want to flesh out some of the final details, but I'm feeling pretty good about it, and I can't wait to show you. Maybe there'll be a few hints during the video, who knows. After the whole process, I basically started grayboxing that design I made in Affinity Designer inside my level editor. Now, this world design is of course a draft, but by having this world design document to lean on, I actually managed to finish up 2 level drafts of the first and second area. This is the first area of the game after the tutorial. My process on how I'm designing these levels is kind of straightforward. I simply start out by adding tiles and platforms where I feel like it could make for interesting gameplay. The overall goal is to get the player from bottom to the top. While adding tiles, I also try to think about what happens if the player falls down in this gap or this gap. Where's the player gonna land? How far are they gonna fall and how much progress are they gonna lose? It's a fine balance that I'm still learning a lot about and something that is gonna require a lot of playtesting. I try to give my levels multiple passes. The first pass is just to get all the platforms from start to finish of the area and make it playable and fun. After that, I add another pass, in which is where I try to make each shape of the platforms a little bit more interesting and kind of try and lean into what the actual shape is gonna look like in the final game. I do multiple passes, but sometimes it's also happening while I'm working on the next area. Of course, it's still just prototype graphics, but I just want to make it a bit more interesting. It's a constantly evolving iterative process. Technically, there's now 3 areas of the game, but the first one is the tutorial area, which is also the one I used to do some early playtesting on. This area will definitely get remade at some point. And now, here comes an interesting part that I've struggled a bit with. I've been playtesting these 2 new areas a lot while developing them, and I simply can't figure out if they're too hard or not. The game is supposed to be hard, but even I was having a hard time completing them from start to finish. I'm very aware that my target audience is not a casual player, so tuning the difficulty to a more hardcore player audience can be a challenge. Because I can simply also just be bad at my own game. But I want to put a build in the hands of a few of my friends who I know love these kind of games and hear what they have to say about it. I've been researching a lot on the topic of level design for 2D platformers. I'll leave some links in the description for the articles I found. There are some great ones that describe different patterns and techniques you can use when designing levels specifically for 2D platformers. Not all of these patterns can be applied to my game, since it's not a traditional 2D platformer where the player can move around with the arrow keys, jump, kill enemies and so on, but there are a few key takeaways that I could use for my game specifically. Guidance is the most important one, I think. This is the shape of your level and how it guides your player through the experience. This can be how platforms are placed and aligned to show the right path, or how some environmental cues like color and lighting can show the proper way. I've been very aware of this pattern while making the first areas, and I'm interested to see if I have succeeded in this. My game is very linear in nature, so it would surprise me if people get lost somehow. Pace breaking are small areas in the game which are used to break the pace a little bit. Typically comes right after a very challenging part of the game, or just before a very challenging part to prepare your player mentally. The way I'm going at it right now is that the start of each area is a little less difficult than the end of the previous one. So when the player finally beats an area, they'll feel a little bit of relief before continuing on to the next area. Branching is where the player can go multiple routes through the level, and it's helpful for giving the player more choice or the illusion of choice. In some games, it will also give the feeling of exploration, although that part does not really apply to my game. But I do try to offer multiple paths for the player, and then the challenge is on my part to not make one path easier than the other. That's also where the risk-reward mechanic comes in. It's possible to make one path easier than the other, but it will be longer and more tedious, while the other path is faster but more dangerous. I'm gonna have to try and experiment a bit more with that. These are just some of the patterns from the article. It's a good read, so go check it out if you're in a similar situation. You might have noticed that my prototype tiles have different colors now, which is also a new feature I added since the last time. I have no idea if this is a feature that will actually make it to the final version of the game, but I felt like it was necessary to have during the development. But this also opened up my level editor to be expanded even further with features, since this allows me to have custom data attached to each individual tile. This is something that is not possible by default in the Unity tilemap system. My next video will be a deep dive into the level editor, where I'll go a bit more in detail on how I actually implemented it. I also managed to add some fun things to my game, like 4 new platforms, the first one being a falling platform. It's a classic where when the player lands on top, the platform immediately falls down. It fits well into the theme of the first area of the game, which is going to be heavily inspired by levels like the dreaded Blight Town from Dark Souls or Valley of Defilement from Demon Souls. In the same kind of category, I've also added a crumbling platform, which crumbles as soon as the player hits the collider. Mechanically, they're almost identical, but it could have different visual cues in the future, and it was super fast to implement. The one-way platform was also implemented, which is for now used to block off the tutorial area, since I don't want the player to fall down and have to repeat that part of the game again. The final one, and the one I've had the most fun with, is the piston platform. It just feels great to be hurled up in the air or across some gap. I haven't found a place for these in the game yet, but I know I'll get to use them in one of the future areas for sure. And even though now they all look simple and very easy to recognize, I know that once the real graphics are in, they're gonna look like something very different. But for now, they're just simple gameplay mechanics that I'm using to test out my levels. There's a whole list of things that have happened since the last devlog, but I won't bore you with all of them in detail. So here's the whole list for you to read. Got it? Cool. And that's all for now, folks. As I mentioned, my next video will be a deep dive about the level editor and how I made it. So if you're interested in that, make sure to subscribe. And while you're there, you might as well hit the like button and click the bell. I would appreciate it a lot. I'm out. Cheers.